I'm looking forward to this conversation with my friend Trevor Timbeck, colleague and fellow coach. We both do work in organizations and know each other through our own journeys of exploring what it is to be human and more of the basis of what goes into our coaching. Recently, Trevor's just published a book co-authored with Steve Chandler on the power of systems. I loved the book, and it was very powerful in distinguishing something that is always there, always around us, and we overlook it. This idea of the systems that are always at play, we overlook that. And it was great when I was reading the book and I was joking with Trevor about now it's everywhere. I can't stop seeing these systems. It's been a lot of fun. Anything you'd like to say, Trevor, to just start us off?
Yeah, it's come from that exploration, which was writing the book for me. It wasn't let me write down what I know. It was what do I need to learn and explore. In that exploration, what started to come up for me was the power of the nervous system as one of our most powerful systems, and the power of what I, in the book, called an emerging source of guidance, or the great system. As I was exploring those elements, your work and programs really started to resonate in a different way for me than they would have in the past. I think that's what then sparked my interest in your Living Miraculously program, and you and I having some more conversations, and then this conversation getting created.
Yes, I'm excited about what you're noticing related to the nervous system, because there is something important to this physical body in all of this. I've also been inspired to look into some of the books you've referred to, talking about Philip Shepherd and Radical Wholeness. That's resonating with me as I'm reading that. And that's been powerful in the way he points to the knowing, or the way we often think is, I know it here. And if I don't know it, then it's not around. But there's this whole physical body and perceptions and sense where the knowing is not coming in isolated into just what goes in from the brain. So I'm excited about that too, and seeing the harmony in what you're seeing physically into the way I look at these things often is in a pure energetic, non-physical state. I heard you use the term mind body, and I thought that's what it should always be called. We should never be referring to a body, and we should not be referring to a mind, because that is deceptive and full of misunderstanding. We should only ever talk about a mind body, because there's no such thing as a body where mind is not indivisible from it.
So I love that you picked up on that and shared it. One of my passions is language, and noticing how it can create problems that don't exist, but then also dissolve problems that don't exist. I got some of that from my love of Alan Watts. He invented the word goes with, and he would say, when you've got two things, he would say they go with each other. And if you try to separate one, you're going to create problems that wouldn't be if you recognize that the front of my hand and the back of my hand go together. I can slice it as thin as I want, but when the last slice of the front of my hand goes away, so does the back of my hand. So it's somewhat ridiculous, but also can create problems if you were to talk about them as if they were two different things. And that's what I started to see with mind and body, right? And I love distinctions, but I also love sometimes dissolving the distinction and seeing that a lot of things get cleared up when you change how you even talk about it.
Powerful. We can go in all kinds of places in this conversation. I know that what we're exploring is so practical and useful for people as they understand something more deeply, which is that they exist physically, focused here. Everything they need is available right there. I'm hoping out of this conversation, people see and distinguish for themselves what's always been available in a way that can be helpful for them.
There's something that you said today on Living Miraculously that so obvious, And I love things that seem after you hear them as so obvious, but so powerful. You said you can only notice now. You can't notice yesterday or tomorrow. You can only notice now, like in this moment. That really landed for me because I have noticed a lot of power come from the noticing versus what do I notice versus what do I imagine. A lot of times I can imagine tomorrow, I can imagine yesterday, but I can only notice things that are here now and present. I realized that most of the time what I was noticing were thoughts, but not as much the body, the sensations, everything else. I love that Philip Shepard's work resonates with you. That's one of my favorite words, resonates. In the book, and when I've done his workshop, uses this beautiful metaphor that he brings out a physical version of the metaphor of the body as a bell. If you take a bell and strike it, you notice it vibrates and resonates, but it stops if you shove cotton balls inside the bell and then you hit it, it just thuds. And he uses that as example. That's what most of us have done, have shoved cotton balls in ourselves with beliefs, all sorts of things, so that we lose that resonance. And a lot of his work is like, how do you find the cotton balls and pull them out? And all of a sudden your body is completely alive and resonating. That's what I'm enjoying about the living miraculous, like seeing that miracles are always, it's just that I haven't always been noticing or I haven't been resonating with them because my attention has been on usually thoughts or imagination or tomorrow or next year.
That word resonating for me is so important. Even in my coaching, when I'm working with anybody or in my Facebook group, different conversations go on. And then somebody may jump in and go, oh, wow, I saw something in that. And I often say, I love hearing that resonated with you. But what it means is it rang true for you. It's not, I knew something and then I wrote about it. See how smart I am? And now that you heard it, because Sidney Banks said, I can't give you this. At the end of the day, he could talk and he shared about the three principles and his insights. What I loved was how he knew that when you see something, that's yours. If something resonates for you, it rang true within you. So it's what you know. It isn't what I know. Because what I know, I'm expressing in different words in different ways. When you hear something and it resonates, it's you've discovered something. You've had an insight. It's a feeling, the physical thing, where you're just like, well, that's true. You know that. It rang true for you.
There's multiple people that you and I share a love of. Sidney Banks, one of them, and I always like to joke a little bit of like, he just missed it when he wrote his book and talked about the missing link and said it was thought. It's like, for me now, it occurs that the missing link is feeling. And I get where he was pointing with that. For me, the thought, everyone talks about the thought and everyone's right, but it's like the missing link, for me anyway, how it comes up is like to the guidance and the wisdom is the feeling. People often say thought, feeling. Umberto Maturana, who I'm a big fan of, says it's thought, feeling. Thought goes with feeling. So to talk about one as the cause, I mean, you can do that if you want, but it works just to be like, it's one thing. What I love about the feeling side, and this wasn't true for me for majority of my life, I love the thought side. The feeling side is where I get that emerging source of guidance. And what you talked about today is so subtle. I had a version of that on my walk this morning. A thought came up. I saw this tree. It was my favorite tree to climb. And it was like, climb the tree. That felt great. And all these other thoughts, which would normally show up as reasons, like, oh, you don't have a lot of time. It's dangerous because I climbed like 40 feet up this tree and you got to walk through all these reasons. But I noticed those didn't have the same feel. And so I went back to the like, climb the tree and that feeling. And I was like, okay, so then it was this inspired action for me. I'm going to go climb the tree. And I climbed up the tree and I love that I did. How often do I miss that? Because there's something very subtle. To me, the missing link was in the feeling, not the idea of it. When the other thoughts and reasons and stuff come along, I would then be like, oh, this doesn't feel as good. If that must mean don't climb the tree because I've got this feeling thinking about climbing the tree. But it's like, no, that is those thoughts about all the reasons why not to climb the tree.
I think there's so much in that where there can be often a misunderstanding in, I had these thoughts that were about that didn't feel as good. And people will speak to that as, oh, yeah, so I was being warned away from it.
Mm.
It's interesting. It's like, I'm going to say is a misunderstanding of interpreting that feeling as I'm being warned away from something. And what I say is there is no warning away from anything. There is only a calling towards something. There is only the truth that calls. That's all it is. The negative feeling is some sort of interference. The calling is constant and steady in terms of what it's moving toward. My interference shows up. You had the thoughts, but that's dangerous, but you don't have enough time. You should be more responsible because you got to get back by. But these are like just thoughts going on. We could say that's not even you thinking. Thoughts are occurring. We think we're thinking some thought, but it's just occurring. And the idea of you doing anything, which is a little outside the norm, has accompanying it some thought like you're going to look like an idiot, or why aren't you doing anything more serious? I don't know how those thoughts got hooked up to me whenever I'm about to do something I haven't done before, but they seem to be there all the time. Noticing what happens when I get interested in them. What are they saying? When I respect them, listen a bit more and notice what happens to the feeling as I engage with those thoughts, which have a very different quality versus the initial thought about seeing yourself climbing. And that quality is so different to what showed up later.
I love that it goes back to the language. Like our language requires subject object, but nature does not. And when we drop it, we could just say thought, but in English, we have to say whose thoughts. And so, of course, it seems reasonable to be my. So I like to say with my clients that it thinks, because that's our universal replacement for a subject. So I'd like to just say it thought that, and it's like, that gives me some distance between my thinking that I must take really seriously, because I don't tend to take other people's thinking as seriously as what I would say my thinking. And when I drop that, it's like, that's not my thinking. That's my experience of all the meditation I've done. Thoughts just show up, right? And when I shift my language, that gets powerful and I get more aware of it. To me, that's the thing. Even today, when you were talking about inspired action and your own coaching journey, right? I sat and like, oh, that sounds like mine. Like a lot of, this is what you should do, but that didn't feel good. So I took inspired action and things happened. And I noticed it thought that you can't do everything like that.
Yes.
And so I was almost going to put my hand up and ask this question, but I didn't, because I just noticed how it felt. It's okay. That thought, of course, comes up of you can't do everything like this. And it just didn't have that quality of feeling. I was like, okay, that's just a thought. Or as Byron Katie says, there are no new stressful thoughts. They're all old ones and recycled. It was just something that I was sitting with. There's something I create now, inspiring and amazing about having this always on, always available, emerging source of guidance. If I can drop all the other thoughts that it thinks about whether that's not reasonable or you can really trust it or count on it, it really came up for me. Even if it doesn't work, I don't see how it could not work. When I'm coming from inspired action, what happens in the world is so different than when I'm forcing myself to take action. That came up for me, the quote from Joseph Campbell about follow your bliss, right? Which is, if I was following that feeling and following the bliss, I would have no guarantee I would make a lot of money, but I would have a lot of bliss. This system may not guarantee certain outcomes. I don't think we get to control that anyway. I noticed I started to get excited about, okay, why don't you run that experiment even more of slowing down, noticing the subtle, coming from that inspired action. And so even after the session with the Living Miraculously course today, I just noticed it there was something that came up, an inspired action thought that was going to cost me money. But when I let go of all the things of it's going to cost you money, I was like, this is coming from inspiration. And so I just did it. That was a lot of fun. And this came up while you were talking. I looked over at my bookshelf, on my bookshelf here, and I generally have books on Kindle. Sometimes I can't get books on Kindle, so I buy them or people send them. I started to realize I love sometimes pulling a book off my shelf to show it to a client or to grab myself. And I thought, and I wrote it down, buy physical copies of all the books you love. And then that just came to me and I wrote it down because it was immediately followed by, but that's a lot of money. And why do you want 2 copies? And it will take up room. I was like, okay, none of those feelings. So it's down here. I'm like, yeah, I would love to have some of these books. I got some of them, but not all the ones I love. And I'm like, maybe it's not reasonable to double buy all of my books. But I'm like, there's something to having the physical book. But to me, it was more of like, it came from this inspiration.
I love that you brought the word reasonable. That's not a reasonable thought. It's not a logical thought. If you have the books, why are you buying these books in physical copy? So you can debate it back and forth, but you can't deny the feeling of when the thought is, why don't you buy physical copies of the books you love? Before any other thought comes in, you can't deny the feeling that there's a certain clarity to it. It's like an energized, inspired idea. What a great idea. And then the ones floating around that counter is, well, that costs money and you already have it anyway. And what are you going to get out of physical? So it's interesting. Now, here's the other part we don't know, because I really love when you said, follow your bliss. Will that make me money? Would that get me client? Who knows? I guess I can't guarantee it. But at the end of the day, I'd have a lot of bliss. What's really obvious about that too is if you go ahead it the other way and you say, why are you building the business? And why are you hoping to get more money? And why did you want to be in that relationship or whatever? Everything would have the answer at the end because that would make me happy. That would make me happier. There would be more joy in that. It's more bliss. If we go back to this idea of indivisible things going together, what if the things that you truly want that are good, given your unique perspective and what you're bringing, what if that energy of bliss is inseparable from those things? Joseph Campbell, instead of saying, you should follow this, and these other things, just said, the one thing you could say is follow your bliss, and everything would be along that. Absolutely everything you would ever want or that you could ever experience in your life.
And I noticed when you did this with your hands, I had a conversation with someone who reached out to talk about the book. I often do this with my hands when I'm making distinctions. As we were talking, he was like, oh, thank you. And he did this. I was like, oh my God, stop. What you just did is you took the two and put them together. It's namaste or a form of prayer. That's what this now means to me. I love distinctions, but I can also always be that I love radical wholeness of underneath. Everything's together in this unity. When I do this with mind, body, or thought, feeling, or anything else, it's like I have this very embodied physical reminder. So when you did it with the bliss, and it's like there's something about the wholeness restoring the integrity. Right? And that's the word I love to use. Even today, when Grace was talking about how tired can be a friend, because it can be a friend to point you to something. For me, I wrote it down. I was like, yeah, it's pointing to me where I'm out of integrity, out of energetic integrity. I just sometimes love systems, terms, and words. They resonate a certain way. I noticed with the tree, there was some sort of energetic integrity, and then I was falling out of the energetic integrity with the other thoughts that just popped up. If I thought those thoughts were telling me about the outside world, I would have thought they were talking about the tree, but they weren't. And it was like, okay, slow down. That's just, as you call them sometimes, rumble strips of I'm veering off from something that was very much in energetic integrity.
I want to go back to something you said about Sydney Banks and the missing link, because I've always thought how unfortunate that he used the same words to point to two different things. And he put a capital on one of them to point it as distinct from the other one. which is a lowercase and all of that. So Sidney Banks talked about thought and thought. That's a distinction. He used the same word. One had a capital, the other didn't. I want to go back to that because when he said the missing link is thought, I've listened to some of his older recordings. He points to the three principles of thought, mind, and consciousness. He said he's using three words, but it's actually one thing he's pointing to. And in a recording, I think the recording was called Feeling, I believe. Isn't that interesting? So I think the recording was called Feeling. He points to thought, mind, and consciousness as the missing link. I thought the missing link was thought. Right? But in Sid's mind, there was no separation.
Yeah.
When Sid said thought, he meant the formless energy of all things, which is distinct from a thinking or a thought that I have, like the climb a tree or not climb a tree. That now has content around it and language around it. Sid was pointing to the pure energy of the creator, that's the energy manifesting into these experiences and the things we are experiencing. I think it's important because he meant more than my thinking. And what he was pointing to is something huge. It's often misunderstood as, well, Sid said it's thought, and really, you don't have any real problems. That's just your thinking. It gets deteriorated a little bit. And he never said that.
I love that you slowed down to go back to it because, like you were saying earlier, it is all in the listener and our interpretation. David Bohm, who I love, the physicist, made the distinction between thinking and thought. Right? He always said thought is past. It's from memory. Thinking is what goes on in the moment and is fresh. I like the verb over the noun of anything because the noun seems to be permanent, whereas the verb gives you its ongoing, flowing river sense. But I love that. Okay, in the moment, thinking can be happening and there's all sorts of thoughts. And when we don't get things so confused, as you said, thought and thought with capital T, small t, like that can cause a lot of confusion versus using a different word or the verb versus the noun. To me, it also can easily leave out the thinking feeling. If we were going to say it, if we would say thinking feeling, thinking dash feeling. As you said, it's like pointing to a different word we could use, like the aliveness or something else that is the formless and, to me, what I would call the great system. I was teasing a bit, but also pointing to the missing link being feeling. My whole life, I've always had thinking and thoughts. And sometimes it could discern between the quality of them or which ones were good, but the feeling has always been there. It's just, I had shoved up a lot of cotton balls, but also a lot of cultural training of feeling's not important. Feeling, you don't need to feel. Like for some reason, at least in the Western culture, we have this idea that we're not biological and that what goes on in the thinking even or in our head can be unaffected what's going on in the rest of the nervous system. That's why I love and I hate the term nervous system because nervous gets such a bad rap. It's really just pointing to nerves. And to me, that's actually interesting to say nervous system and nerves. Maybe that's open up a new possibility for when we use the word, I feel nervous. That's the power of words. It can be useful to play with words, right? Or experiment with different words because they'll have different feelings and you'll have different reactions to the words. If we use the feeling as the pointer and the guidance, we can not get stuck on a specific word and be able to translate or dance with whatever word the other person is using.
I like that we're getting to the feeling part because in a lot of Sid's work, he kept pointing to the feeling. He talked about a beautiful feeling. What you're looking for is a feeling. What you're listening for is a feeling. That's how he would express this. How are we discerning an energy? We notice feeling. And what does that mean? What's in there? That's where it's the constant the wisdom. Sid said your wisdom is in a feeling. He was even more specific. He said your wisdom is only in a positive feeling. That's pretty specific. If you say your wisdom is only in a positive feeling and you take what would be the most positive feeling you could have, bliss, it's probably a good descriptor, right? So there's something that is whatever comes from that level of energy or vibration is a wisdom that is worth paying attention to.
There's something about that. I'll say something about our ability to hear it. I didn't have the ability to hear it. The other day I was going through 5 or 6 or more of Sid's CDs that I got initially, and I would listen to them all. So much of what he shared resonated with me. I got the 3 principles, but I didn't hear the feeling part. What would happen is I would hear the feeling, and then my cultural training would kick in. And what came up was feeling can't be reliable. Feeling couldn't be trusted, right? And so then I thought, oh, that part doesn't resonate. And it wasn't that. Actually, I love when every time he would say, when you get the feeling, pop the tape out and throw it out the window. I was just like, I don't know what about that, but I love that. But then it would think other thoughts like, you can't really trust. And then I thought and said, oh, this feeling part doesn't really resonate with me. But it was just the cultural thinking of thought isn't as respectable as rationality. To me, that's what makes me laugh. The work of Humberto, the biologist, opened my eyes to whatever we call rationality is built on top of emotion. At some point, takes math, science, whatever it is, you're going to get down to first principles, which means you can't ask what's underneath the first principle, or else that would be the new first principle. So first principles can't be picked because of logic. If there was logic to picking first principles, that wouldn't be the first. So the only choice of how you pick a first principle is emotion.
Wow.
And so that just blew my mind of, okay, underneath all this logic, rationality is emotion, because it had to be some emotional or feeling that guided you to pick a first principle. Now, of course, you're then going to test the first principles, right? But what was underneath it, that just opened my eyes and ears to, and so re-listening to some of Sid's things, right? Oh, yes, if I pay attention to the initial feeling I have when he talks about feelings, and I can distinguish it from all the thoughts that it thinks about feeling, which are actually now occur for me as rumble strips. There was something that I missed in that in the beginning because I didn't get where he was pointing with feeling.
Yeah, you and I had this fun conversation I think you shared recently on Facebook where you posted something and then I posted something. And then it was this very fun conversation because you said we were dancing, something like that. This is where I've had a lot of values from the understanding of Abraham Hicks and that teaching. It says the same thing and uses other words, other language. And one fortunate thing is that Sid spoke about the energy of all things, the essence, which some would call mind. That is an Eastern idea too of mind as that. He said some would call God, this essence or energy before what's manifested. And then he spoke about as being mind, thought, consciousness, and it's an energy. Abraham Hicks speaks about, they'll use a term vibration. And after it occurred to me is vibration, like that's some movement. And so you think of energy, right? It would be a movement, like an essence, a movement. And it's hard, like you can't quite think vibration and turn it into a thing. That's hard I can't wrap my mind into that. So that was interesting. Abraham will say, who you are is pure source energy consciousness. And a part of you has focused into this physical existence. Part of your consciousness has focused in a physical perspective, while the greater part of you remains non-physically focused. There's a you and it's just nothing. It's non-physical. And then there's this physical that is like you and I here talking. But the greater part of this is more energetic. Greater part of each of us is more energetic. Feeling becomes this movement or dance that's happening between the greater part where you've referred to the great system, always in integrity, always whole. Everything comes from that, the source. And then there's a finite, less whole perspective. My perspective is less whole, less inclusive of all. Thinking, which is not whole, I can feel the vibration of that thought and thinking, which is not whole. I can feel that vibration juxtaposed against whole, which is all inclusive, nothing left out. My current thought, which is not whole, is separate and has lots of messiness in it. Sid called it contamination. I never liked that. When he said that, I go, come on, Sid, don't call my thinking contaminated. It's just not inclusive. It is finite. I can't include everything in the thought. And it's separate from that over there. By the time it's a thought, it's pretty different than this. And so now we talk resonance. Here I am. I've given attention to a thought. You shouldn't climb that tree. That's ridiculous, right? It was just a thought floating around, but I picked up on it. I gave it some attention, and you give it some attention. It's an energy, a dancing energy, a vibrating energy. So in giving it attention, I began dancing with it. As I began dancing with it, I activate that vibration within me. And when I activate that vibration within me, it is juxtaposed up against the whole, the vibration of the whole, that vibration of an all-knowing vibrational energy. So these two up against each other, you will feel it, because you will feel the distinction, the difference between those. We're fortunate because we are physically focused, and this body is a reflection of exactly that. So your body will vibrate with that, and you will feel. So, and I'm curious with the nervous system now, as these energies are flowing, there's a place to sense or pick up on this. Which is not in my head wondering, is this a good thought? Was this the whole thought? I think it was pretty whole, because I think it was a pretty big thought. I can't get there from it.
It's part of the reason I was going to say I prefer, but that certain terms resonate with me. And they are those terms of vibration, resonance, harmony, coherence. I love those words because I love the metaphor, but also how they feel for me. And that points to Philip Shepard's work. He talks about the pelvic bowl where we can feel and come to rest. And it's like a parabolic shaped like resonator to pick things up. Or I'm a big fan of Buckminster Fuller. He would talk about integrity. He did integrity days and structural integrity and all the rest. He always said he was a perfectly average person and anyone could do what he did. But he said as an individual, seemingly separate consciousness, we are just non-simultaneously apprehending the universe. So it has to be limited, right? Because we can't simultaneously apprehend everything. Someone said God invented time just so everything doesn't happen all at once.
Yeah.
From this perspective, it's definitely not whole and complete, but as a possibility, I had access to it through the vibration, and I can notice when there's incoherence or coherence. I can't do it at the rational, logical level. You could try, but that's why I love Humberto's work, to see actually all of that rests on emotioning. And why I love words, because he always said conversation is the braiding of words and emotion. Even if you change the words or use the same word, it's if you have it listening from one emotion very different impact than if I'm in another emotion. And so I love the term braiding. The braiding of language and emotion is what he called conversation. To me, there's something powerful in the nervous system and its ability to pick up on all of the vibrations. That's what the nervous system is doing. Everything works through some sort of vibration. Even sight is vibration of light, and sound is vibration, taste, smell, everything is vibration. So we've got this beautifully designed nervous system to pick up on vibration. It's just a very tiny amount of it gets into the brain or the mind, like the conscious attention of what we would then call thought. If what shows up in what we call thought is 1 to 10 bits of information a second, the body is processing 1 billion. And so it's dealing with 1 billion bits of information, and a little tiny fraction of it, a rounding error to 0 comes up. Essentially, we know nothing. Like that rounds to nothing in your conscious attention. But there's something in the nervous system, and you hear stories of someone being able to pick up on something that they couldn't express or verbalize. And there's something powerful in the great system and its design that said we don't have to go through, because thought and thinking and language, even I love language, but language is linear. This is why Alan Watson would always joke, why it takes you so many years, 18 years to get an education, because all the words are linear. You have to go through it. But you could take it all in the way we take in sight and the way the body can take in everything at once, non-linearly. We could, but also nonlinear communication might be troubling and difficult, right? If you had to write a book that wasn't in a linear order.
Right. Wow, that's powerful, because it opens you up to thinking, to wondering about the possibility of what can I know in what do I know? What's available in a nonlinear way? We must have experience of this. This is where art and poetry. So I do have a knowing that is before the expression of it, which then there's a knowing that I'm expressing into words. People write poetry or they'll write music because they're attempting to jump beyond the limitation of logic. Music would be similar, to go past what that limit is. Sidney Banks would always say, you can't listen to my words. If you're stuck on my words, you've missed it. What's important is before the words, or it's beyond the words. I'm speaking to it, expressing it, but it's over there, and don't stay here with this, he would say. And people would argue with him about his worth. I don't agree with the lie. I find myself that way too, where I've said something, someone argues with me, and I'm like, I don't agree with that either, what I just said. But that wasn't what I'm pointing to, because what I'm saying in words is limited.
Yeah, that's why I love poets, right? Because poets know they're attempting to say something that's ineffable. And yet that doesn't stop. Like they'll go on and do it, but they know what it is. I'm a big fan of Wittgenstein. He said, anyone who really understands me will know that what I've been saying is nonsense. Once you've climbed up on the ladder, you have to throw away the ladder, and then you see the world rightly, and you'll look back and look at what I've said and said, that's nonsense. And that's why I love the verb versus the noun. The words aren't really information. There's some sort of dancing. That's my favorite metaphor, or coordination of behavior, some sort of pointing that when you get beyond there, as much as I love words, it's not, ultimately it isn't the words, right? That's the first time I heard Alan Watts talk about the difference between the menu and the meal, and say to people like, you eat the menu. We would think someone's crazy if they go into a restaurant and they ate the menu, but he's like, you're doing that all over the place because you're unaware that the word is not the thing. And words are what we've got to help us. I mean, we've got other things too, right? Like the sound of rain doesn't need translation. We've got other things we can point to help, but we often get stuck. And that's where I find the feeling helpful. And that's why I love poets and poetry, because what happens is some feeling gets evoked and you're like, I don't even know what the words were, but the feeling that got it.
And Abraham speaks to the words they use about, say, Because of that indivisibility, your source energy focused into a physical existence, and you are interpreting vibration. So they'll speak to that, interpreting vibration into thought, which is really forming it into something meaningful to me. If my perspective was whole, then there'd be no difference. You would feel nothing and simply know. But to experience whole, there must be from a perspective, or there would be no experience of whole, because whole is all there is. So there is a perspective that already is a vibrational interpretation into a perspective, and all else becomes more interpretation.
Yeah. We have a saying people use all the time of it takes one to know one. But I've noticed it actually takes two to know one. Even when people want non-duality, it's like, why would you want to, first off, I don't know if it's possible, but if it is, why would you want to get rid of the two? It takes two to know one. Right? You need the contrast, the yin and the yang. That's why I love to use my hands and then bring them together. If it was just this, we couldn't know or experience anything. But when we have them separated, even my favorite definition for distinction is the cognitive act of creating a difference where there isn't one.
Oh, wow.
And when I remember that, yes, distinction is useful, right? But it's always the cognitive act of making a difference where there isn't one, because really it's just all one. Alan Watts would always talk about it. It's really just God playing hide and seek, because if you were all knowing, where's the fun in that, right? You've got to hide so you can seek, and you've got to have two so that you can know one that's very resonant and useful to see how language can trip us up. Even if the words are tripping us up, the feeling, it's got our back, so to speak. There's the feeling is there, the wisdom, it's in the feeling. As long as we don't forget that we're interpreting the feeling. That's why I struggle with positive versus negative feelings, because people add so much interpretation onto it. I usually say empowering feeling or disempowering feeling or coherent feeling or incoherent, just because
Yes.
they have a lot of baggage with positive negativity. But there's something in the feeling that is so powerful. When I slow down to feel it, most of the time, I'm either going too fast or I'm actively numbing and ignoring, but missing all of that intelligence.
I have found useful a channel teaching Bashar is explanation of positive and negative. So he speaks to a positive as including and bringing together constructive and expanding. He speaks of a negative or negative thought or negative as a disintegrating, separating. So when I heard that, I thought, oh, that's interesting. When I go down a path separating things out and keep going down that path of separating them out, and it's different. The other is eliminating, because that isn't good, but this is, right? So separate, that isn't good, and let's remove that, right? So that is how he describes negative. And in that interpretation, what I saw is it's a direction which is unnatural. You keep moving toward less truth and further away from truth, because truth is whole, truth is including, truth welcomes all of it. So that's what's true. You can't get away from the fact that there is whole. The further you move into any sort of attempt that is a direction, you'll feel it more and more. And you'll feel the disharmony in it, the dissonance rather than the resonance in it.
Yeah, that's what I love about that shift to resonance and dissonance or disharmony and harmony. Is like, I can feel that. I don't have to think about it. And like you said, it's even here, again, because I'm such a word geek, right? It's like science, the SCI in science means like to divide. right? It's the same
Yes.
SCI as in scissors or in schism
Yeah.
or schizophrenia. It means to cut and divide. And that's what we often do in science is cut and divide to analyze. But that's why I love the word system. One definition of system is organized whole, like the systematic view, the systems view in science. There's a whole branch now of systems view of like, okay, how do we, instead of disintegrating and cutting and analyze things, which can be useful, how do we integrate it? That's what even there I see, like you need both, right? You need to cut and divide and you need to integrate and bring them both together. There's something powerful in that shift away from when I can use words that are easy to feel and I don't have to think about, is this a positive thought or is this a negative thought versus like, was this an integrative thought? Is this coherence or harmony? Do I feel empowered by it?
Yes. When you said a few minutes ago, how did you say it? I make distinctions, or what we're doing is we're making distinctions where there are none. It gives a different understanding to the terms. I know Werner Hart and others where they said, we're making it all up. Right? When you spoke to that, you said, I create this distinction where there is none. Right? We're making it all up because what there is just a whole. This is where, and a misunderstood quote where Sid said, it's all thought. When he points to this vibration or energy. And Abraham has also said, you're making it all up, right? Your creation is you're making it up. You're telling a story, you're creating it. All creation is whatever you're making up. And you're doing that when you can see that there's all thought. It's all an energy like that. There's just a certain freedom. This opens you up to all kinds of possibility.
That's the empowerment, the freedom of language for me and the power. I was thinking about it. If somewhere on my bookshelf is a book called The Laws of Form by George Spencer Brown. If you love math and it's like he recreated things from the ground up. At the front of the book, he has the Chinese characters from the Tao Te Ching. One translation is, the beginning of heaven and earth has no name. And so I love that. That's how he starts. And then that's where I got my distinction, my definition in this case of distinction. He said, a distinction is the cognitive act of creating a difference where there isn't one. The book is actually not really information. It's a series of acts. One of the first things he says in the book is draw a distinction. He shows how this very basic distinction can prove all of algebra and calculus, but there's something so powerful of that freedom of it's all made up. And another way of saying this is, in the beginning was the word. I would say in the beginning was a distinction created out of nothing, but give us something to play with. And when we know that, we don't get tripped up if my distinction's different than yours. Well, that's not the truth. You can say it's all energy. It's all a dance. And I love that metaphor of dancing because our language says there's three things: a dancer or multiple dancers, dancing, and a dance. But that's just our grammar. If I say there's no dancer and there's no dance, there's just dancing. When people talk about God, it's like, this is all the dance. If I look at the dance, I can see the dancer. It's not some mysterious thing. For me, it's just all dancing. Energy's dancing, or thought is dancing, or use whatever word you want. In knowing that all these distinctions are made up anyway, it's like you can use whichever one you want. There's so much power and freedom. And I say workability. If we could all get to that understanding, we would all experience it.
Yeah. What I've noticed is a lot of conflict has to do with, I think you brought this up where it says the conflict is, I love when you said in one of our dances, we say, I understand you. I understand what you're saying. I just love this, where it was so obvious when you said, I think more accurate would be when we talk to each other, we say, my misunderstanding of what you just said right now, my misunderstanding is this. And that would be a more accurate way to speak, because this is my misunderstanding of what you just described. And then we could be open, at least.
Yeah. That's one of those ones where the feeling was the guidance. It was Steve DeShazer. I was watching a talk by Steve DeShazer, and this is how he started his talk. I'm like, who starts a talk like this? He stood up and said, I'm just so glad I don't believe it's possible to understand anyone. All you can do is misunderstand them. And then my question is, are you misunderstanding me in a useful way or a non-useful way? And he said, so I'm about to go talk for an hour. So you'll have something to misunderstand. And then you need to ask questions. So I'll know if you're misunderstanding me in a useful way.
Wow. Talk about way to be generous, allow some space for people to express themselves however they want. And as you say, for me to own my misunderstanding. It's my misunderstanding. I've thought through when you've said that and I've laughed about it. How would I argue with you? How would I get into a debate with you about my misunderstanding of what you just said? I completely disagree with my misunderstanding of the statement you just made. It would be very funny.
It reminds me of a story I heard from Anthony DeMello. Two monks who had been living together for 40 years got along all the time. They never fought. They never had conflict. So one day, one of the monks was like, should we try conflict? Because we haven't had any conflict. The other monk was like, sure. Of course, he would say yes. And he's okay, great. How do we do that? And he's grabbed a loaf of bread and said, this is my bread. You can't have any of it. It is all mine. And the other monk said, okay, you can have it. To me, the insight there is conflict requires two people for conflict. It's not one. If one person says it's mine, the other person can be like, okay, that's what I love about the misunderstanding. Even if no one else has the same misunderstanding I have about misunderstanding, it's what I heard from Byron Katie. And this is why, like, sometimes people are like, how do you know all these quotes? I'm like, because of how they resonated, how they made me feel when I heard them. Byron Katie said, the first act of war is defense. It's not attacking someone. The first act of war or conflict is saying no or something else, or being like, I understood you and you're incorrect. But like you said, it kind of all dissolves when you're like, I'm misunderstanding you. You're misunderstanding me. I probably misunderstand myself. Like you said, sometimes I say, I don't agree with what I even said. It's all misunderstanding. We can get over trying to reach something called understanding, but now we don't ask, are you closer to the truth? It's just, is it useful or is it empowering you? If you misunderstand me in an empowering and workable way.
Wow. This has been a great conversation. I love where we've weaved and moved around. How do we complete it?
What comes up for me is, I don't know if this is a closing, because I think every close is a beginning. It's really a beginning of something. It's the beginning for me of the possibility of bliss, that all-knowing intelligence, having guidance and having something always available, like what you talked about today. If I slow down and I'm present and it's all here and I don't go into my imagination, I don't know what it is, right? Like you said, how do we conclude? I have no idea how I conclude this, but I notice the feeling is a lot of excitement and empowerment and a call to just continue exploring and experiment.
That resonated. So that really resonated. We're not inviting people to conclude and end it, which I hope instead is an opening to something and more access to bliss. As I reflect on what we've said, it's opened up pockets of less insistence on some hanging on to things and a more loosening of some of those things, which is, of course, then an opening.
Why I mentioned to you, and I use that metaphor, I always love having conversation with you, is because you're a wonderful dance partner. Because as soon as you conclude something or know something, that's kind of like gluing your foot to the floor. You can't dance. You can go in circles, but you can't dance, right? Every time I've explored you or in your groups or your programs, you're a wonderful dance partner. So thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. This has been a great dance. And thank you. And
thank you. You too.
Thanks for this conversation.